Hey, how's it going, friend? And welcome back to another video. And one thing I learned from my previous video that annoyed me was my mic kept popping when I would talk into it. So hopefully that sound doesn't suck, but hopefully this fixes it. But today I want to talk about Bible translations because I think it's a big topic and it's a really important topic, not only for as you personally follow Jesus and also as well for my fellow youth pastors out there in just understanding translations, because you're going to have students asking you questions, you're going to have people asking you questions, and you're going to have to decide things for yourself. So I wanted to make a kind of a video. This is a really basic video on Bible translations. I'm not getting into really big technicalities and things like that. So if you want a really in-depth view of Bible translations, this won't be your video, unfortunately, but this is a basic view. So first off, let's ask kind of the big question of why are there so many Bible translations? It feels like within the English language, there's I think actually a few thousand different translations. So why are there so many? And the big reason, the really simple, basic reason is because the Bible was written originally in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And so obviously it's not in English, so you have to translate these languages into the English that we have. Now there's a lot of history about Bible translations, about the Latin Vulgate, the Septuagint, and a bunch of other things. We're not going to get into all of that today per se. But the big idea is that it takes work and it takes time to translate from these languages into English. And so the big question of why are there so many translations is because translating, let's say, modern day Spanish into English, two very close-knit languages, in modern day, there's never really a clear, precise, concise one-to-one translation between two languages. So a fun little example is like in Spanish, you have sleeping bag, or in English you would say sleeping bag, but in Spanish you'd have the bag of sleeping. And so the one-to-one translation literally kind of isn't exact from Spanish to English, and that's just modern day things. And then you also have like idioms and phrases. For English, we have things are a piece of cake when it's easy. But translating that's kind of like, if you translate that one-to-one exactly, it doesn't make full sense, and it's kind of confusing of what do you mean by it's a piece of cake. Whereas some of my friends growing up were Russian, and that same phrase in Russian is like it's like peeing on a stick. So you have different languages that use different phrasings and idioms to explain the same concept. And then you get to even more complicated things of like, you have the word, let's say the idea of you get quickly into action, you spring into action. Well, that idea can be explained a whole bunch of different ways, whether it's specific word for word or the idea or the concept. You can explain it more concisely or more elaboratively. There's just a lot of different ways that you can go about translating one concept from an old ancient language into English. And it just gets complicated, and it's not just a super easy, okay, that word means this, here you go. That word means this, here you go. It's a lot more complicated than that. But I know for some people, especially maybe if you're newer to the faith or you're just kind of intrigued by the Christian faith, you would look at that and go, wow, okay, so there's a lot of great reasons why we can't trust the Bible, because who knows what they're saying in the original language? And that's an argument that people have been making for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And here's why I say we can fully be confident in the translations in English that we have today. All of the major translations we have are done by committees of people that know way more about the Bible and manuscripts and languages and how all of these things work than any of us combined know about them. And so you have very smart people in a committee of very smart people that are translating these Bibles. And so it's really, really, really difficult for one, the translations to be of poor quality, and two, for them to put an agenda behind them. It's really difficult to pass an agenda by, 15 incredibly well-educated people. It's very difficult to do that, especially when they're all there for the sake of translating the Bible in what's the word I'm thinking of? Especially when they're translating the Bible as true as they can and they have a real motive to translate the Bible accurately. So It's really difficult to have an agenda behind them. You have a lot of very smart people doing it, and so I'm fully confident that we are translating the Bible very well. Plus, we have so many manuscripts, so many copies of so many parts of the Bible that it's really difficult to not have something good to base our translations off of. So that's a little bit of the very brief, basic, simple history of translations and how we get to them. Now, I think for you, whether you're this is for you personally, or if you're a youth pastor, how these different translations work in your life and in your ministry. So, in the process of translating, there's a bunch of different approaches that people take in how they approach translation. So you have kind of the basic ones, which are word for word, I forget, there's a different word for it, but I forget what it is off the top of my head. Translation. So you have word for word translations, then you have thought for thought translations, and then you kind of have this paraphrase sort of pocket over here as well. There's some more, but for simple sake, it's kind of those 2 or 3. And so translators have to weigh the word for word translation, or being as close to accurate word for word what the original language is saying, or kind of conveying the thought behind what exactly is being said. And so translators weigh out those 2 things in their translations. Either they just fully opt for, we're going to go as literal as possible, as word for word as possible. You think of like the NASB or the RSV. Those translations, they're very literal. Even ESV is one of them. They're very literal, and they're very true to just what the word says is what the English equivalent is going to be. The big problem with those is they are much harder to read because Greek syntax and grammar is not the same as English syntax and grammar. And so you get funky sounding sentences, and things are just worded not in a way that you would typically word them. So they're harder to read, but you get much more of an equivalent to an exact word of what the original language was really saying. Then on the other side of that is you have thought for thought, which is more of doing some of the interpretive work for you. And so you're not quite getting exact word for word, but you're getting the concept that is being conveyed by the passage. And so you're gaining readability because now it makes more sense in English for us to understand easier, but you're losing out on the literalness. But then on the literal side, you're losing out on what it means sort of so much, and so you have to do a little bit more interpretive work yourself. So those are kind of the 2 ends of the boat. And so some translations that you can look into based on either side is, if you're going for literal, you can look at NASB, you can look at ESV, there's RSV, there's the New King James, NKJV, yeah. And then on the thought for thought side, you have more like the NIV, you have translations like the CEB, you have kind of more on the paraphrase, which is a little further on the thought for thought. You have NLT translations, you have a bunch of different translations you can choose from. So it all depends on you and what you're trying to look for. Personally, when I'm reading, I read through a bunch of different translations. I hop around from the CSB translation, NIV, NLT, and NASB. Those are kind of my typical ones I reference the most often. So then in your youth ministry, how does all this stuff apply? I think for youth pastors, I think a really great thing to think about is what is sort of the translation that you default to, and having a really good informed reason why, or a thoughtful reason why you have defaulted to those translations. So for me, within our youth ministry, we have 2 translations we most often go with, and that's the CSB translation and the NLT translation. And the reason for those 2 is because, one, the CSB is my default, and I find that it's literal enough, like the ESV or the NASB. It's literal while updating some specific words that I think just make a little bit more sense for like a student or someone that's a little bit newer to the Bible. There's just specific words here and there that just kind of don't sound as archaic and don't sound as old-fashioned, but they sound a little bit more up-to-date and a little bit more modern, so that it's a lot quicker and easier for a student to understand what's being said while still being pretty literal to what the original language is really talking about in the word for word. So that's my default, is the CSB. And then on the other side is I recommend a lot to students the NLT translation because I think it's one of the easiest translations for students to understand because surprisingly enough, I totally agree with this, but it's the one translation that sounds the least like the Bible, which sounds weird, but a lot of people have this perception of the Bible sounding very just formal and put together, and there's just this interesting tone and wording of the Bible that feels King James-esque. And so when people don't read that in the Bible, they're like, this doesn't sound like the Bible. And so the NLT, I find for students, sounds most like how they talk and actually word things. And so interestingly enough, it doesn't sound like the Bible to them, which is just, it's a weird way to put it, I know, and I think you probably get what I mean by it, but it's just really, really easy for students to understand, especially if they don't know anything about the Bible, which reading and understanding the Bible, I think, is the most important part. If you read the Bible all day long, but you have no idea what's being said, then it's kind of, dare I say, useless. Dare I say that? So finding a translation for students that they can read and understand, I think, is vital. And for you personally, if you don't know what's being said, then it kind of feels useless to read the Bible. Obviously, there's a lot more to that, but at a basic level, reading and understanding the Bible is the key. So hopefully within your youth ministry, you can think through of some translations that you can reference most frequently, or the ones that you can, I would say it's standardizing of, like, we use CSB and NLT. That's kind of our two translations. I use NIV and other ones here and there just when wording makes more sense or whatever it is. And so having that bit of understanding of translations and how you can use them, and then also how you can use them as a youth pastor in your settings, I think can be really important and really impactful for helping your students understand the Bible a little bit better this week than they did the week before. So hopefully this is helpful for you. And if you like this content, give it a like if you'd like, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. So thanks for being here and watching. Peace.